Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Claims Never Sleep. And today I'm joined by Dan Berkowitz. Dan, welcome to your very first podcast episode. Are you excited?
Thanks so much, Megan. Yes, very excited. I'm a longtime listener, first time co-host, first time participant. So I'm really excited to get into it and get to our great conversation today. I think we touched on a lot of areas, and it was a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and I'm so happy you joined me. And it was kind of on short notice. And you were like, yeah, I'll do it. And, we had a nice chat yesterday about what to expect. And hopefully I lived up and I lived up to the expectations of it being no fuss and it'll be fun.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So, and so today we have on Kari Adams, and she's a senior VP at Physicians Insurance. And part of the reason I did bring you on to join me for this is because when I spoke with Kari a few months ago, one of her passions and pressure points was bad faith claims, and you handle a lot of bad faith work. So you were the perfect person to bring on and carry on this conversation with Kari with me. So with that, let's bring her in and let's talk about some bad faith.
This is the Claims Never Sleep podcast, presented by Cruiser Mitchell, with your host, Megan Henry.
Good afternoon, Kari. Welcome to Claims Never Sleep. I'm so happy to have you today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And I should let our listeners know that, this is like really a third time's a charm recording. We've had this on the books for quite some time, and the fault is mine. I kept having things come up that just either took me away from my computer or I wasn't going to be here in order to record. So I'm so happy now. Third time's a charm. We're here. We got it. And we got Dan to join us as well.
Hello, I'm so happy to be here.
So, you and I had talked way back when, I think it was in like late April, early May, about this podcast. And you were just so thrilled. You're like, I'm so happy someone is doing this and doing a podcast about claims. And with that, when I get, everyone on from the claims industry, I love hearing about everyone's paths because I have yet to have anyone on who's said, I wanted to be a claims adjuster and go into claims, and that's what I'm doing. So I'm curious, are you our one, or is your story like many others that it's a profession that you fell into, happy that you're here, but wasn't one that was intentionally on your path?
Yeah. I have been in the insurance industry for so long that I had a prior boss that imagined me as a little girl with pigtails and instead of a lemonade stand, like a free claims advice stand or something, because I have been in the industry a long time and I did fall into it. My first insurance claims job was during high school as a file clerk. And it just beat, restaurant work at the time, when you're 17, 18 years old. But then I started realizing how varied the work is, and I just kind of continued in the field, earning my degree at night. And I started in service, so for a company who sold auto policies. So I was the person that quoted, cars, flood insurance, homeowners policy. And then when I was fortunate enough to work for a large company that had a professional liability unit, I looked at that and said, wow, that's really interesting type of claims work, working with physicians, dentists. There were some errors and omission type professional liability policy, and that just really fascinated me. So yes, I've been doing it a long time, and it was something that I am not an outlier. I fell into it just like everyone else.
Although, you were a little closer, and like if you started as a file clerk in high school, you actually were a little closer to starting the path right from the beginning than any other guest I should say.
I sometimes say that insurance is, that old Eagles song, Hotel California, you can check out, but you can never leave. I think some of us who've been in it for a long time, we used to say, especially when you're in your 20s, oh, it's just, I'm going to go, for a while I thought maybe I wanted to be a nurse. And so I thought I'm just going to go to nursing school, or I've heard people say, I'm going to start my own business, those kinds of things. But it's an industry that's so specialized that once you develop those skills, and it is interesting and rewarding work, I would say, that it just kind of keeps you here.
Yeah.
You mentioned wanting to be a nurse. Do you think maybe that's what gravitated you toward kind of medical negligence kind of claims once you were in the industry?
I think so. My mother was a nurse, and so I remember some of her, anatomy books and looking at a child, and that's why I did think insurance might just be a detour for a while. But then I started thinking, gosh, I get to help people. I know it may seem not quite analogous to helping people, but I think in claims we do help people. I mean, we speak with people during the most stressful parts of their careers or their lives, and it's completely rewarding to, settle a case and make sure the patient returns to somewhat near whole, helping a physician who's very stressed. It is a very a career where you can make an impact. But then it's also intellectually very challenging in terms of, the law changing, medicine changing. You can always expand your knowledge and take on different assignments depending on the carrier you work for. You can manage outside of your home state. You can manage multiple product lines. It's just a really fascinating career, I found.
Yeah. And I mean, that actually, I was on the phone with someone earlier this week, and they said something very similar to that, this is an industry of helping people, and you're helping people kind of at some of their worst points, and that they're going through like just a really hard time, and you actually are there to help and assist, not to go against and not to say, oh no, we're not going to pay you, or no, this claim, like what I've heard through talking to so many people is that it's just this misconception that insurance companies are out to, disclaim coverage rather than find how, they can find coverage for their insureds and pay them what they're owed.
Right. And I have the privilege currently of working for a mutual company. And so, we are not beholden to our stockholders. We're beholden to the owners of the company, which are physicians and hospitals. And so we really look for broad coverage. We look for resolving claims efficiently and fairly. But I understand insurance has gotten a bad rap, and that's kind of one of the reasons why we're talking about bad faith today, is that there's been a lot of changes in the industry in terms of statutes and in common law that really kind of holds insurance carriers quite honest and ethical. But that's such a bad stereotype, I think.
Yes.
When many claims professionals and defense attorneys and all of the individuals we work with are really trying to get that case resolved and do it, fairly.
Yeah. So Kari, you finally broke the silence. You brought up the big bad topic we're here to discuss today, at least ostensibly, with bad faith. I was just wondering, obviously you've been in the industry for a while. I believe you've been at Physicians Insurance and worked your way up for a long time. What do you think has been the biggest change you've seen over the years when it comes to bad faith claims? Is there any development you've seen that interests you, or maybe is a pain point for you and your company?
Well, in Washington State, our Unfair Claims Practice Act, IFCA, was instituted, I guess, 20 years or so now, and that does allow for compensatory damages along the lines of attorney fees, emotional distress, and even treble damages. And so that, as well as the CPA or Consumer Protection Act claims and then common law claims, just allow for, large recoveries. So it's, very much a deterrent to the insurance industry in our state to, not be fair in claims practices. But that is quite a large threat that had changed in our industry over the last many years.
Yeah.
And with that though, like how has it changed, or how does it change how you evaluate or approach claims that when there is a bad faith allegation? How does it change it for you?
Well, we certainly have instituted a lot of practices around tracking policy limits, demands, timely acknowledging claims, all those good practices that we should always hold ourselves to. But the situation that we sometimes find ourselves in is that plaintiff attorneys not now recognize that as another avenue for recovery, right? So the claim may or may not be developed. It may or may not exceed the policy limits, but we're now seeing premature policy limit demands, sometimes pre-litigation, sometimes early in the litigation, and it really, forces us to very quickly evaluate that claim and determine whether that case should be settled. Where plaintiff attorneys, some were always of that interest, but now we're just seeing so much more of it. If they can make a policy limits demand and get a potential payment quicker without having to prove the claim, versus us exposing ourselves to that risk, has really changed the way we practice.
And is that something that you're feeling specifically with Washington claims? Because I know earlier this year, the Oregon Supreme Court in Moody kind of opened the door. You're nodding your head because you know where I'm going. Open the door for sort of extra contractual tort liability when it comes to bad faith. Now, they might not have the whole statutory scheme that Washington does, but it almost seems like this is a development that bad faith is possibly expanding. Now, maybe it's confined to the Pacific Northwest or maybe not, but how do you see that developing? Do you think there might be a trend toward more states adopting these kinds of mechanisms?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure you're familiar with the statement, bad facts make bad case law.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that Moody case was an insurance dispute over a $1,000 death benefit. So, when we monitored that, we predicted that was going to open up a layer for bad faith in Oregon, where previously it wasn't that case. So certainly Washington has always had an issue. I think I mentioned to Megan before, in Washington, there's actually a mechanism for a covenant judgment, where if an insured policyholder doesn't believe their interests are being protected by the carrier, they can agree to a settlement with a plaintiff attorney not tied to the policy limit. The court hearing has to occur, deeming the settlement reasonable, but it can be done with very short notice, no discovery as to whether that amount was reasonable. And then the policyholder assigns their rights to the plaintiffs, and the plaintiff then sues the insurance company. And so, that has been a factor for us for years. And I believe it's allowed in maybe one or two other states. I don't hear it as commonly as that. And then Oregon, with that development of the Moody decision. We also handle cases across the country, and we're finding in Georgia the use of Holt demands, which are a 30-day time demand, and you have to be very careful in how you clarify details of that demand, because it can be deemed as a rejection. So as we are moving into other states, we're really educating ourselves, because it's become a real area of recovery, I think, for plaintiffs, as opposed to just the policy limit and going through the investigation and the evaluation and the negotiation. You can just miss a deadline, and all of a sudden, your coverage defenses are gone.
Yeah, that's like one of those things that would wake you up in the middle of the night. Like, did I miss that? Like when you have that terrible dream and then you have to check everything, and like, I know I didn't miss it, right?
Yeah, lawyers have that nightmare about requests for admission and those deadlines.
Oh yeah, we sure do. Like, did I count right? Did I count?
Yeah. No, when Kari, you bring up the motion of consent judgments, and obviously that's been a thorn in insurers' sides for a long time. And if you're practicing in any state that has a developed body of case law, hopefully there's at least some outs or some avenues for the insurer to try to challenge reasonability and all those kinds of things. But it made me think, so many insurers that I've worked with over the years complain about direct action states like Wisconsin, where, they can be sued directly by a plaintiff who's been harmed if they know who the policyholder is. But in the terms of a consent judgment, you'd almost rather be a defendant in the case, because then at least you're getting served, at least you're getting notice, right? You have a chance to show up at this hearing. So it's an interesting little nuanced piece of how all this works.
Yeah. So I would say it's very interesting that you bring this up in terms of other states and maybe other types of insurance, because in medical professional liability, we've always felt that physicians and large institutions may not be interested in those kinds of consent judgments because it is reportable to the National Practitioner Data Bank. It can be reported to a state medical board. Their insurability is a huge issue. So when we speak with mediators, they tell us in other practices, other insurance lines, such as like big construction defect type cases or casualty cases, that's like the first question out of the plaintiff's mind when they come to mediation is, is there a consent judgment opportunity here?
Yeah. And I mean, and that kind of ducktails into, this is a conversation I had recently. Someone who was in the medical claims atmosphere as well, that the physicians, when they have claims made against them, they take it so personally. So I can imagine having a consent judgment and potentially being having out there that it can they might have real trepidation about that.
Right. I think that most physicians would not want to go that route, but they've dedicated their whole lives to the practice of medicine, and the possibility of having some kind of excess judgment that they're responsible for, or this offer to end the litigation, it could be quite appealing.
Yeah.
And Kari, unfortunately, you and I haven't had the chance to work together, so I don't know for a fact, but your policy is generally physicians insurance. Does the doctor need to agree to a settlement? Because I know that's often a common term because of all these reporting requirements that you discussed.
That's correct. So we do have consent policies. So if a physician consents and we're in the middle of negotiating a case, but they don't feel their interests are being protected, which in general ours don't feel that way because we communicate fully, we apprise them of offers and demands, we track timelines, we get evaluation of defense counsel. But a carrier in the state, if they weren't doing all of those things, could lose that defendant physician to that option. So it's not quite, there are some conditions of our policy, but once they demand settlement, if it should occur, we're going to be looking to protect them.
Yeah, well, and I'm sure that, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but I'm sure you've dealt with the opposite too, where you think that you have a decent, reasonable settlement and maybe the doctor wants to fight it all the way or doesn't want to settle. I mean, how do you deal with those kinds of situations?
So that brings up a good point, because yes, you have to inform your policyholder of potential excess verdict as well. And if you fail to do that and a case goes to trial and there is an excess verdict, they could, decide that that's a time that bad faith has occurred. And so we do apprise them early in the litigation of any excess potential, hopefully not in a too scary of a way, right? Some of these cases, the way they get filed sound really large. You don't have defenses developed yet. So we want to work with that physician all the way through and let them know that when there's time to make decisions, we know more information, we're going to be evaluating that with them. So that is definitely a necessary in protection of bad faith.
Well, and certainly there has to be another layer of concern when you see so many of these excess nuclear verdicts, particularly in the medical malpractice space, that at least we've seen so many of them, even in Philadelphia, not even in Philadelphia, just Philadelphia just has a lot of nuclear verdicts, but like the potential is always is so there, and they're giant, and that has to, cause a lot of extra stress for the physicians when it could go outside of your insured layer.
Right. I think I was just reading some of the industry news today that I think Philadelphia had like a $40 million verdict against a healthcare system there. So it is really concerning. I mean, the pressure has been driven up. The policy limits are only so much, and we find that we're still want to try cases because we don't want physicians to become an easy target, hospitals to become an easy target. But you really have to have almost every box checked before you go to trial. The records have to be good. You have to have really tried and authentic experts. You need good witnesses. If there's any, missing document or weakness to your case, I think that's where we see the large verdicts is, the story was just too easy to tell. And certainly to avoid any, taking any cases to trial that could create anger with a jury. Obviously, I think that kind of sending a message, safety culture is really driving a lot of these large verdicts. And that is concerning in handling claims.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, we've certainly seen it a lot around my parts around here recently. I guess there's a lot of good or a lot of easy stories to tell that have been resonating with the juries, or, however, there's been other ones I've heard, other malpractice cases lately that, there's been defense verdicts. You just don't hear about those as much. They obviously don't get as much fanfare as the big dollars do.
Right, which just creates this more drive for settlements, more, the bad faith pressure with the claim severity. We, a few years ago, created a website exclusive to our defense counsel. And we use it to publicize information, exchange information around experts, etc. It's getting so old now, we're needing to revamp it. But I'm hoping to use it to really publicize these defense verdicts and bring a little bit more reassurance into the industry.
And have you found that to resonate, or is it getting some traction for you?
I do think, I agree with you, Megan. We hear about 3 defense verdicts, and then it's followed by 1 large verdict. And then when we're talking with our defense counsel, that large verdict gets pointed to as, an issue that we need to be concerned about. And so we're not quite getting as much traction as we like, but I do think that there's, podcasts like this help educate our defense communities. I think there's a lot of American Legal Connections, ALC, is very helpful in sharing information. There's other industry organizations, and I do think that claims can and should collaborate as much as possible with their peers. I know there's always competition, and maybe on the sales side, there can't be as much collaboration, but I think the defense bar really can and should. What's that saying? A high tide lifts all boats.
Yes. Our Rob Cruiser Mitchell loves that phrase.
Well, and it seems to me sometimes it's, venue specific too. There's just sometimes everyone starts collaboratively, but when those high damage cases come about and there's disagreements about allocation of liability, then we all kind of break down, and then maybe parties settle out, and then that turns up the bad faith pressure against the carrier, because all of a sudden they were lockstep with co-defendants on a case, thought that everybody was going to trial, and then a party settles, and now there's that lone defendant with a policy that's saying, oh, you better settle this and get me out of this case now. So that just doesn't help moderate settlements either, and increases the bad faith risk.
And what have you seen, or what have you noticed that are some of the bigger, like, bad faith red flags that you've seen? Like what is triggering it more often than not when you get those letters?
I think that, the plaintiffs may have had this case for, like in Washington, the statute of limitation is 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so they may have had that case for a long time. And our member is just getting notice. We're just getting the file. We're just getting defense counsel on it. On the face of it, the way the complaint is drafted, it appears to be a bad injury on a, maybe a moderate sized policy limit. And so they really take that advantage then to write that letter,
Mm-hmm.
create, I know that it's very intentional to create that stress on that policyholder early. We've gotten policy limits demands with an offer for that covenant judgment of, let's say, $14 million on a $2 million policy on Christmas Eve. Right? I mean, it's so intentional.
Yes. Merry Christmas.
And, yeah.
We're going to let this clock run when no one's working.
I heard that, like, during COVID, that was a strategy. They knew maybe people weren't coming into the office as much, and so they were sending it during that, period when maybe nobody was there or offices weren't back and running. And so, it's a real educational process too with our members to talk to them that we might anticipate that this is coming during the life of this litigation, and it might be early without much information yet. And our obligation to you is to work this up. You have the right to understand these allegations against you. And so if we respond appropriately with competent counsel, trust us, and we can continue to work through this and determine that maybe the settlement value is well within the policy limit. And we're going to get there, but it might take a few months. And that's going to be beneficial to you because that report to the data bank on your claim history is going to be, palatable at that point. It's going to allow you to get re-credentialed at a hospital or to get insurance without your rates being raised. It's going to prevent you from being a target if you're in a small community, even though, settlements are usually confidential. So, when you walk through our members, they understand, but the strategy is to get it early, before we have time to evaluate that claim and really kind of intimidate maybe the defense counsel, scare the member physician, and hopefully even scare the carrier.
I mean, those are some dirty tactics.
It almost sounds like what you're saying is the best defense against bad faith claims is a good relationship with your members, with your policyholders.
That's exactly true. Yeah. One of the ways we do that is, having lower caseloads. I do feel bad for my peers that work for carriers that have, really large caseloads because you really don't have time to develop that relationship with your policyholder, really work closely with that policyholder and the defense attorney, have periodic calls, meet in person, those kinds of things that really go a long way for a relationship to be built where that risk is going to be little to next to nothing.
But while I think, like, in your industry, that seems to be more possible because, typically the types of claims you're going to see are going to be like larger, more complex claims. I think a challenge comes, when it's a higher volume, less exposure type, like motor vehicle type claims. Not that they don't see bad faith there, because they certainly do, but
Right.
it's just like your adjusters just have the medical malpractice claims are just complex, and they're very nature. Like, there's nothing simple about them. And not to simplify a motor vehicle accident, but it is a little more simpler than a medical malpractice case.
Right. Yeah, I think this was a few years ago. I was speaking with defense counsel about Florida, and like homeowners, bad faith really increasing there. There'd be a claim for X. The carrier couldn't get in to really evaluate the damages. There'd be a demand for the policy limits because, hey, this damage is going to exceed it. And the carriers would be saying, we haven't even had time to evaluate it, but it would be too late. Game over, bad faith. Now limits are lifted, and it's not that policy limit that's at risk. It's, all damages that flow from that.
Yeah.
So yeah, we even have seen now, I think this might be a little bit of a more novel approach, but we're even seeing an allegation that before a policy limits demand is made, you had information to indicate that you should have tendered your policy limit early. And so we've really modified how we document, correspondence with the plaintiff attorney, kind of setting that record of, we received this claim on month 1, we asked for the records month 2, month 3, we didn't get it. Month 4, we took a deposition. Month 5, we tendered the limits, because they're actually saying, well, you should have tendered your limits month 1. You knew, you had the medical records, you had an opportunity to interview your doctor, and therefore you're now in bad faith because you didn't tender your limits absent a policy limits demand. So we're kind of monitoring that situation rather closely, because that's recently been something our coverage attorneys have been informing us of.
I mean, this goes to this other conversation I have a lot with people, is how the plaintiffs bar is so organized and they all talk. And I mean, that tactic definitely seems like it's like there was definitely a meeting or a conference or something somewhere that they're like, hey, this has worked for me, we're doing this, and then others kind of latch on, and it, and now it's becoming a trend. I mean, and we don't see a similar defense, strategy trend happening either. It just doesn't, it doesn't correlate,
Right.
and so it makes it really tough, because they know they, like, once they start talking about this, they can get you on these things.
Yeah, that's so funny you say that, because there must be some, listserv, bat phone, something that they all pick up. And I'm sure that bad faith is not something that everybody deals with every day, knock on wood, right? I mean, but it's not something that I feel like we talk about very often when we go to conferences.
No.
Like it's a true confession or something. If, you're training your staff on bad faith, or, you're tracking something, but it's really something that I think we all need to educate ourselves, because there's just some normal best practices I think everybody can adhere to. And if we do share what our experiences are amongst the defense community, I think that would help a lot.
So
you mentioned,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. I would say you mentioned training your staff. I mean, what steps have you taken at physicians? Is it state specific? How deep does it go when it comes to letting your adjusters know about the various pitfalls of bad faith?
Yeah, I have always thought that a really educated and experienced claim staff is the best. It provides for the best outcomes, right? Which is what we all want for our policyholders, for the plaintiffs. And so we really think about offering training, bad faith in particular, every year. And we invite our coverage attorneys to come in and provide that training. I remember, many years ago, you kind of, as a claims adjuster, you knew how to write a reservation of rights letter. You had a calendaring system, and you tracked things as best as you could. And then sometimes carriers would engage in coverage counsel. Sometimes it was in-house. It was like trial by fire sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
When you got a little bit over your skis on something, that was sometimes how you learned. And I'd like to kind of help our staff or the industry not have those near misses. So we also do state-specific training. We do send our staff members to conferences. We do periodic roundtables with our defense counsel. So it can be, what happened in the Moody case, or what happened in other cases. So I'm just a big proponent on bringing staff along, because these could be very painful experiences.
Yeah.
And you're going to get the best outcome for everybody by just having that knowledge.
So in your experience, though, what do you have almost like a list or something in mind of what are some of your bad faith best practices? And I'm not going to, I mean, obviously every situation and case is different, but when you're talking to your department and you're talking especially to the lesser experienced adjusters, do you have okay, you get this letter, or you get a claim, and you take these steps, or you get this time demand policy limits demand letter, these are your steps? What are some of Kari's best practices?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I do have a little mental checklist, and depending on how many cups of coffee, it goes into full throttle, or sometimes it but we do tend to think about, it starts with timely acknowledgement of claims to our members or policyholders, correct? You really need to know the state requirements, whether it's, as soon as practically possible, you acknowledge a claim, to, 21 days. You may want to think about very gentle reservation of rights letters in some of your acknowledgement letters. And that's a training issue, depending on your intake staff, whether they can identify those types of reports that may be subject to a coverage issue, or just as a system practice, a very gentle reservation of rights in your acknowledgement letters. And the identification by staff to escalate those for any further review. That's one thing. And then, secondly, duty to defend, really looking at the four corners of the complaint. And if you have a coverage trigger, assign defense counsel. Do not wait on that, or just recognize your duty to defend.
Yeah.
Separate the coverage file from the defense file if necessary. So those are just kind of some early things that in a really busy claims department can be easy to overlook. But then when you're starting to get into the case, letting staff know to escalate those policy limits demands as soon as possible. Get help. We don't expect them just to be on an island. Get help. We use a smart sheet tracker so that all of our policy limits demand is tracked. We also track tenders, since not approaching an additional named insured on a policy, or additional insured on a policy on a tender can also be an area of bad faith. But specifically to policy limits demands, one will track when the response is due. We immediately inform our policyholder member of the demand in coordination with defense counsel. Usually we really kind of want to schedule a meeting and talk through, you want your defense counsel's evaluation. Do they think it should be accepted, or is it premature? Then who's going to write the response? And make sure that it's done timely. Is it going to be the carrier? Is it going to be defense counsel? Does the policyholder have personal counsel? You're going to want to run that response letter by the personal counsel. So those would be some really top tips that we just kind of, as soon as we see that come, kind of engage some of those thought processes.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple different areas where bad faith can creep in. I mean, independent counsel is yet another one, right? If you're
Yeah.
in California with Cumis Counsel or Illinois with Peppers Counsel, or that's a whole other area where there could potentially be allegations of bad faith as well.
Yeah.
Well, I remember early on when I was a baby lawyer, and I mean, just whenever I hear the word like policy limits demands, I remember getting those policy limit demand letters and being like, you gotta, as soon as you get that, that was like whatever partner told, it's like, if you get that across your desk, you stop everything you are doing. Like, and that gets your attention, and then you pass that on, like you just like, and I remember the stress of that. I mean, and I remember feeling like, okay, like if that ever comes across my desk, and it did a few times, it was like if that goes immediately.
Yeah. Well, that's great because we are going to spend some time with our defense counsel this fall. We have a defense counsel workshop, and just to talk to our defense counsel about the insurer's perspective on that, because you can get that so premature. It can be easy to go, that's ridiculous. Let me, write this. You're wrong. This is too early. We'll get back to you, after some discovery's been initiated. But, there may be times where it is a potential settlement candidate, and you really want to kind of maintain that open line of communication. And instead of saying, we want an extension or no way, it may be, we would like A, B, and C. And then we'd like to proceed to mediation after sufficient time to evaluate A, B, and C. So it kind of sets the tone with the more collaborative plaintiff attorneys.
Yeah.
I'm sure they get all kinds of responses from all carriers, right? But if they know, okay, this could be a very reasonable carrier who's just trying to do an investigation. I do want to get my client their recovery sooner rather than later. And this carrier is showing me that that's more likely to happen. So we may get a response back that says, we'll give you these things, but we really hope you're not delaying, and we'd really like to see a mediation scheduled before the end of the year, right? Those are going to be the kind of plaintiff attorneys you can work with. The other time we'll see when the plaintiff attorneys are trying to set you up is like, nope, you had your chance, your limits are lifted now. We want to know your policyholder members' personal attorney because we want to talk to them about, a consent judgment in Washington. And, at that point, you may just have to continue to stay the course, knowing that you're going to continue to work that case up, and maybe you're already getting preliminary reviews that show you have defenses or the damages aren't that large. So we've seen those kinds of letters 2 or 3 times in the life cycle of the claim where we're giving you one more opportunity and you're saying, no, we still don't agree with your evaluation. We'll still go to evaluation, mediation with you. And they're, you know that they're just kind of setting you up.
Yeah. Well, and that also comes with experience though, too. You might know that, and experienced claims handlers and experienced attorneys might know that. But, if you have a baby, adjuster, they might, they might not understand some of the nuances and, or see the writing on the wall, so to speak, of, what's coming down the pike.
Right. I think that's true. And I think it's true of defense counsel because we're not their only client that practices this way, right? They might work for a hospital with a tower of, $100 million. And maybe there's kind of the bad faith pressure in between the excess carriers at times, but that's not their bread and butter work. So it is really around the education of our claims handlers. And I hope that people don't see the title of this podcast and run for the hills and maybe that baby adjuster or defense counsel will listen to it and go, yeah, it's maybe some practices that are incorporated will prevent, something that if I just had knowledge, I could have prevented.
Yeah. You talked how much education is important, educating the policyholder about how this process works, educating defense counsel. Are you sure you didn't want to be a teacher instead of a nurse?
No. Maybe a little bit of that too. We'll see. But
Well, I will say, like in your role, you have to do quite a bit of teaching, right? Like you have it's continually educating and teaching your team and your department of new developments and look and how you respond to things is not a one size fits all approach, and things evolve over time. Just like how you mentioned that the Moody decision in Oregon, that changes how you're going to respond to things and how you handle things. So it's a fluid, right? And you're always going to have to teach. So yes, I think you are in a way you're in a teaching role.
there was even a case out of Eastern Washington where the court held that whatever the claims file handler had done, which would have been appropriate, 6 months when they were handling it, was no longer appropriate at that time. I can't remember the case, then I think it's the security case, was the name of the plaintiff, but held that the adjuster was still held to be responsible for knowing changing legislation and therefore found against the carrier. So even in Washington State, there was a case in 2019, Kadala, I'm probably not pronouncing that well.
Eola.
Thank you. But that held that the adjuster could be sued for bad faith. So,
yeah, it was a Pyrrhic victory, right? Basically the court said, well, the adjuster can't be held individually liable under this statute. However, maybe common law, I don't know. So even the victories in Washington sometimes aren't victories.
Yeah. So I think, claims, it can be a stressful job. We've already talked about how it can be rewarding. I think most people who get into it love the variety, love the intellectual challenge, love working with the people that we work with. And so if you can avoid some stress to that file handler by being better equipped to negotiate or avoid bad faith or determine an appropriate defense strategy, is really what our hope is.
So how about outside counsel, though, because you have to have some advice in your bag of tricks over there as to outside counsel and what you're looking for as to a response to bad faith allegations and how you're looking for them to respond.
And so you're meaning our defense counsel,
Yes.
The panel counsel. Yeah. So yes, I think that having defense counsel be immediately concerned when they receive that policy limits demand and not responding on their own, having a call with the file handler, like, defense counsel's evaluation and how should we inform the policyholder? Is it right before their deposition? Is it on, the eve of an important holiday for them? But certainly you need to let them know right away. And then working with them on the style and the tone of the letter, as I mentioned previously, and making sure it's sent timely.
Yeah.
So there are attorneys who've been doing this in Washington, or other states that it's a little bit, can be more of a challenging environment for years. But I do think that bringing up the next generation around this issue, because we don't expect our defense attorney to be coverage lawyers, right? Mm-hmm. So that's an area.
You can find someone who can do both, just not on the same
yeah.
Yeah, someone who can both, just not on the same file.
Yeah, exactly.
But they don't know the pitfalls, right? I hope that none of us are ever deposed or, or file handlers or defense attorneys or anything like that. So that's a invisible world to them, right? They don't even maybe understand all of the consequences that flow from just like the littlest of details.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was something else I was going to ask actually on the coverage side. I'm sure as a coverage attorney myself, it'd be great. And we would tell you should get us involved in every case, but that's probably not practical. Even every bad faith case might not be practical. So, I mean, what is your own personal litmus test of, I think maybe we need to involve coverage counsel, whether it's, in-house or outside?
Yeah. Well, we are fortunate that we have really strong general counsel and corporate counsel that's just either a few steps away from us or a phone call away. And I know that they really want to avoid bad risk litigation against the company. So they'd rather us escalate anything that has an issue. And then we kind of roundtable that whatever matter that's been escalated in terms of it going to outside coverage counsel. We've developed relationships with firms that have national presence. So we have some really trusted coverage counsel. And at this point, we have a weekly call with coverage counsel. Usually there's something to talk about.
Yeah.
And so it's just better safe than sorry in a way.
Yeah.
And it's probably governed a lot by, as I mentioned before, some of the territories that we manage claims in being a challenge. And so we don't tend to have a high threshold for moving things to outside coverage counsel.
Yeah. So, we're just about out of time, and I didn't want to close this up without asking you this, though. Knowing what you know now and looking back at like your career progression, what advice would you give like your younger self, looking back being like, okay, this is where I am now and this is where I started? What advice would you give young Kari as to, your career path and how to navigate it?
I would say, and when we go to interview people now, I do ask this question a lot, and it's just around, can you ask for help? That's not a sign of weakness. And it's really helpful in the claims world, to admit what you do not know and to ask for help. I think that we all want to be perceived as being competent, once we've reached some certain amount of experience or authority. But this world is ever changing, and I think I develop more trust in people who come to me and say, I don't know how to handle this, or I've never done this before. It allows me to grow. It allows them to grow. And you're just going to be a much more trusted and skilled professional, claims professional in particular, if you can manage to be a little bit vulnerable.
And let's face it too, like if you don't ask for help and then you do it wrong or completely incorrectly and you completely mess it up, that's not a good place to be. Like, look, we all mess up. Everyone makes mistakes. None of us are perfect. And you do learn from every mistake that you make. But if you're too proud to admit that you might not know something and not look for a helping hand, then the joke might be on you when, it kind of blows up in your face.
Yeah. I mean, everyone makes mistakes. That's entirely true. But it takes a big person to say, yeah, before I make this mistake, can I tell you about this situation?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, like, it just, I don't know. I feel like whenever you ask, I do feel that some people are hesitant to ask questions because out of a fear that they want to do it the way that they want to do it, because it's like, okay, this is my end game and this is where I want to be. And if I do it, this is where I think I'm going to go. And I feel like there's a fear that if you ask a question, then someone might make your path a little more complicated and you're going to have to do more work or you're going to think more about it. And you're like, well, but I liked my first solution. Like, that was good. And now, now I asked Dan a question and Dan said, well, what about this? And I had to think more about it. And I couldn't just be done with that task. Now I had to put more time and effort into it. But in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be, the end product will probably be better and you'll probably have a better solution, or you may have solved that problem in a better way. But I think there's a fear of like, well, if I ask, then I'm gonna have more work because I'm gonna have to think more, do more. rather than just be like, okay, got it done. Next, moving on to the next thing.
I mean, I guess, you as lawyers, you're paid for your competency, or when we work with physicians, they're skilled and trained to use their judgment in a certain way. And so, it's probably inherent in us as human beings, as well as sometimes in our professions. But it really, I think, can be quite helpful for people to get out of that thinking, and you end up with probably a better result.
Oh, you always. I feel like you always, like the more input you get from others, and the more you think through your problem, I think your solution is going to be stronger and more well thought out and a better plan. It just might take you more time and more brain power.
Luckily, attorneys get paid by the hour, so
I know. Well, Kari, I really, really appreciated you coming on. And I'm so glad I'm sorry it took us 3 tries, but I'm so glad we finally were able to connect after, a few tries of getting there. And I hope everyone listening, was able to gain some more knowledge about, I guess the scary world of bad faith, but maybe you made it a little less scary. And, was able to learn a few things today.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you so much for having me and keeping up the scheduling obstacles until we could achieve this. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks for your insight, Kari. Appreciate it.
And of course, for everyone listening, if you like what you hear, please like and subscribe to Claims Never Sleep. You can find us on your favorite streaming platform, and you can also find us on YouTube at Claims Never Sleep Podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
This is the Claims Never Sleep Podcast, presented by Cruiser Mitchell, with your host, Megan Henry.